Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behavior nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behavior geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behavior nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behavior geeks.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for a very special podcast episode wherein we combine the hosts of many different animal podcasts. We're going to introduce all the people who are involved in today's special recording, starting with Gray Stafford. Hi, Gray.
Hey, how are you guys? I love this idea. I think it's wonderful, the different content that you all bring to listeners all over the world. I started Zoologic over 5 years ago because much of my career was storytelling, I realized. I was a trainer and performer and keeper and all those things. But then somewhere along the way, I realized, hey, I've been telling these animal stories for many, many years now, often on live TV. I'd like to help people tell their stories and tell stories maybe that we're all not aware of. So that's what led to Zoologic.
Ryan Cartledge is also joining us.
Hi, everyone. So I decided to start my podcast, the Animal Training Academy podcast show, back in 2016 when I was just beginning to dabble with online content. Interestingly, it was during a zoo consultation in New Zealand where the curator suggested the idea of starting a podcast. Even though I was clueless about how to go about it, I took up the challenge and went ahead without fully understanding the potential of what it could turn into. So now, after a fascinating journey of 7.5 years, we're 204 episodes in. And it's been an amazing experience so far.
That's very cool. My co-host is here, Ari Bailey. Do you want to talk about what we do?
Sure. Yeah. So we started our podcast because the pandemic happened and we sat around panicking slightly. No, we were totally calm. Everything was fine. We were trying to figure out what we were going to do while we were not doing our usual thing. And we came up with a handful of, I think, great ideas. But Chris had kind of said something to the effect of a podcast would be cool previous to the pandemic. But while we were tossing around brainstorming ideas, he was like, I want to do a podcast. And I immediately said, I want to be your co-host. And Steve said, great, have fun with that, and just turned us loose. And I think he's maybe listened to like half an episode ever of the, how many do we have? 170 something?
Somewhere around there.
Around there. So I've always said that's like his, to me, the biggest vote of confidence from Steve is that he completely ignores what Chris and I do on here so that we have that trust from him to take this and run with it. But yeah, it was born out of necessity, kind of. And we just really like talking to each other and talking to people in our field and learning things. And what a cool format that we were able to utilize with very little skill or knowledge in the area. I mean, Chris had some skill for sure. I had zero. And my first podcast I was ever on was Ryan's. I was on Ryan's podcast, I don't know how many years ago, a while back, but that was my first podcast. So that was cool. I got to be on Ryan's show. And that was pretty much the only experience I had. And we just kind of ran with it, made a commitment. We would do this thing once a week, and we have stuck to it since the pandemic happened. We have not missed an episode. Every Thursday Friday, there is a new episode out. So something both of us are very proud of doing.
We have worked hard to make a weekly commitment for the TEC Talk podcast presented by naturalencounters.com. Or that's not .com. We do have that website, but that's how that works. Yeah, it's very fun. One of the reasons this group of people here specifically is because we all have sort of relationships with each other in that we've interacted with each other either professionally or through each other's shows. And that was fun to think about, that we have Gray has been on our show. Ari and I have both been on Ryan's show. Shane has been on our show, and I have been on Shane's show. So Shane, why don't you introduce the final piece of this group of 5 that we have together?
Yes, and I have the youngest podcaster, as Ari said before we started recording. I'm the baby podcaster here.
Nice.
And that's because we have a whopping 19 episodes just launched in February of 2023 this year. And I'm the host of Animal Behavior Conversations, the podcast of the ABMA. So it's a podcast that is used as a resource through the channels of the Animal Behavior Management Alliance, in which Chris and I are both on the board of. And this is really cool to be here because I got the idea to do this from the people that are on the Zoom and listening to those podcasts. And I used to always be an audiobook listener when I was working out and doing all these things. And then I got into podcasting and all this, really liked it. And then one board meeting, we were talking about how we can create resources for people. And my motivation for creating Animal Behavior Conversations was the fact that I've been very lucky to have had some incredible mentors, especially earlier in my career, that really helped me learn the science of behavior change and about behavior. So our podcast goal, we're very young as we're breaking down the more fundamental aspects of the science of behavior change and moving on from there. So excited to be here with all these amazing contemporaries.
It's a pretty great group of people, and by no means exhaustive. We understand there are other animal and training and behavior related podcasts. So you can feel free to sling arrows and fire our way if you're upset that somebody else isn't on here. But that's good. Let us know who else you would like to be on an episode like this in the future, where we get to bring people together who don't normally get to do this because we're all busy doing this on our own. And what we did basically ahead of the schedule was, floated this idea. I think it'd be really cool for us all to get together, not only to talk about the experience of doing shows the way we do on a weekly basis. I think at least Ryan, you probably do even more than that, but to give us an opportunity to not just be a single voice where one person is asking everybody a bunch of questions. All of us kind of started asking questions of each other or having ideas about things that they might want to discuss. And we don't have a real strict plan for how this is going to go. So I'm just going to look at Gray and say, hey, Gray, I think you were the first animal podcast I ever heard. And that's the only reason I'm going to start here. Anything you want to pick the brains of this group of people with, or any thoughts you want to share?
Well, I've been impressed by how each of you and your shows stay very close to the industry. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like each of you are really focused on operant conditioning. And we've done a fair amount of shows on operant conditioning and applied behavioral management techniques. And if you look at our top 10 or 20 shows, those episodes dealing with LRS and talking with Steve or Ken Ramirez or other well-known trainers out there, those generally are at the top of our download list. But what I like about all of you is how you've been able to stay in touch with the facilities and talk to people specifically at facilities in real time, because that is hard to do, because a lot of facilities historically are kind of closed off. They're, getting someone permission to talk about a facility or what's going on in a facility. So I'm curious how you've all been able to achieve that. Are you doing it strictly through your friendships, through your professional associations, or what's your outreach technique?
Ooh, that's a really good one. Ryan, how about you? If you want to start with that one, because I know you've gotten anybody I can think of in the field just about has been on your show, and many of them multiple times. So what's your strategy for that?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'd just like to say that last week I referred someone to your podcast, Ari, because they were talking about giving feedback to each other in the zoos. So even though it's been like ages, that's still something that I refer people to a lot. And Chris, I still remember your story about the Harris hawk, and I think giving it nesting material as reinforcement during the shaping process.
Yeah, that's a thing.
And celebrating 19 approximations for you little baby podcasts. That's awesome. I think it's changed over 7.5 years. I think in 2016, people were like, what's a podcast? And it was people didn't know what it was. And I would connect with them to record, and it would be the first time they'd heard of that type of content. So to start with, it was reaching out to people. And I think also it was so novel then that everyone was like, yeah. Some people now will be like, oh, another podcast, and they're still happy to do it, but it's very different. Then it got to a period where I didn't have to reach out to anyone because I was just getting so many people reaching out to me and being like, hey, can you have this person on your show? And they set up introductory emails. And then the show was just managing itself for a while. And then COVID happened, and then the podcast library grew, which is fantastic. And so I found myself having a mixture now of reaching out to people, exploring new avenues that I want to learn about, and having people connect me. So it's a mixture of ways of connecting now.
Shane, how's that been going for you? Because you've been really good about having guests on every single episode, which is something Ari and I didn't decide to do early on. So sometimes it's just the two of us, but we get to have the two of us. So that's kind of nice. We've each done the episodes completely by ourselves too, which is fun. I heard Gray do that one time when he was supposed to have a pretty infamous person in our field on the show who didn't show up. But how do you go about that, Shane? Because not only are you having to navigate that for yourself, but you're also doing it on behalf of a greater body within our field. So that kind of puts some responsibility, but it might also give you a little bit of backing. You get a little bit of authority behind you because people go, oh, I know ABMA. So how's that gone so far?
I think one of the coolest things is because it is a community, there's a lot of people that are involved at ABMA and are reaching out and saying, or letting me know, hey, I have this person that would be great to do that. And one reason that I really want to have guests is because this podcast is for the ABMA. I want to be a mouthpiece to lead discussions, and I don't want to be the podcast. That's why I really enjoy getting guests every single episode and trying to find a wide range of guests as well. We've had a couple of people that I know from ABMA that are heavily involved because they're in my immediate circle, but also a lot of other people from around the industry that have said, hey, you should be on this podcast. I reach out to them and like, absolutely. But one of the coolest things actually coming up. So after this episode that airs in a couple of weeks, there's actually someone, his name is Rodrigo. He's currently in Singapore. And he just was always commenting on LinkedIn saying that he really enjoyed the episodes. And so I just messaged him on LinkedIn and asked if he would want to be a guest. And he's going to come on and talk next week. And there's someone, her name is Daisy from Australia, that the same thing. She was commenting and I just Facebook messaged. And so that's been one of the cool things that I've been able to reach out to people that are already passionate about this, and they're all really excited. And I'm excited for them to be able to be on something that they've really enjoyed so far.
That is exactly how Chris likes to rope in guests for our show. Is literally we tell people they can email us, and then they email us, and Chris like responds, and then at the end of the conversation is like, and would you like to talk about this on the show? Because you could totally be a guest if you want to come on the show. And so I think that's a really cool way to get guests on the show, because it's great when we have people on the show that are big names that people recognize, right? That's awesome. Or somebody that is really prevalent in our field and people recognize and have great information to share. But there are so many people in our field that have such a great perspective and good information to share that other zoo professionals may be able to relate to even better than somebody who is a big name trainer in our field, because they are going through the same things. They're on the same place in their career path. And hearing from, we've had one of the guests we had a couple months ago was Natalie Sunray, who was somebody that we invited onto the show just to talk about breaking into the field. She's new, all this stuff, and like had a great conversation with her. She applied for a job with us. We hired her, and now she's a full-time trainer with us in one of our shows. So like the like full circle moment moment of like seeing somebody who's trying to get their foot in the door or working as an intern and seeing them progress in the field is so relatable, because if you look at social media and we try to stay away from zoo creepers and see how that conversation is going, we can see the common struggles with this younger group of people that are coming into the professional zoo field. And hearing from people like that, I think, is just as valuable as hearing from Steve Martin or Ken Ramirez or whoever's on the shows to talk about really important big picture concepts that have to do with animal training. So I think that's a cool concept. I love that you did that with somebody who was really engaged. And same thing happened with Josh Flagg, another one who came to our workshop, listened to the podcast, emailed us, applied for a job. We ended up hiring him. He's a full-time trainer with us as well. So I'm not using this as a way to recruit anybody out there, but that's happened. But I think it's cool to hear like everybody's path of like how are they getting information? How are they sharing information? What is helpful to them? And hopefully that helps mold how we're sharing information on the podcast so that it is valuable to people who are listening. And Chris and I have said a bunch of times that, we probably would just talk to each other if nobody listened anyways. And I don't know how we still have stuff to talk about after close to 15 years of talking to each other, but because we enjoy having conversations about this stuff. But if it can benefit other people in the process and we're able to bring more people into that circle and have that conversation publicly where other people can benefit, I think that's just like the icing on the cake.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's what's nice is our experience thus far mostly has been that getting people involved with our show has been very much like the way I feel about our industry overall. When we do things like go to conferences, it's that idea of like, well, we can ask, what's the worst thing that can happen? Somebody ignores me or says no. So, running around and being like, oh, there's so-and-so, there's so-and-so, there's so-and-so. And, in general, this field is so accommodating. I think the only challenges we've run into so far have been people who work at institutions that have very, very strict guidelines about. I think we did an episode one time, Ari, where we had somebody from public relations that was sitting in silently. So there was an episode of 3 people, but there was actually 4 in the room. So that was fine. We didn't have an issue with that. We were very clear that we tend to do things off the cuff and just, record what we want. But we always give everybody the opportunity to say, hey, if we went anywhere and you didn't like it, let me know. Sometimes we'll send them the full episode and go, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm going to post. You okay with that? But that's been few and far between. How about you, Gray? I mean, you know everybody. So I think you've been able to kind of have access at like all kinds of levels. I mean, have you had this challenges with that?
It's kind of you to say. I agree with what you both said about it doesn't hurt to ask, because if you don't ask, the answer is always no. And I've pitched more animal stories, more shows, more opportunities, and most of them go unanswered. And so part of our job as podcast hosts and producers is, of course, being a booker, right? And that's a hard job. I have new respect for all my booker friends in media, because very often you don't get an answer whatsoever, or you get strung along, et cetera. And sometimes you do get those PR professionals that have to sit in, or they want questions ahead of time. And to some extent, yeah, I'll accommodate that, but I never go into a full interview, and it doesn't sound like any of you guys questions. I like to have 1 or 2 to get started, and then we let it go organically. I usually have an end goal in mind where I want to land, but how we get there changes by show, by guest. And so I think a lot of it is just being persistent, recognizing that people's schedules are, fluid sometimes. And I also treat guests much like I treat training animals. I ask one time. If I'm getting blown off, I don't ask again. Not that my show is all that in a bag of chips, but at the same time, it's like, hey, we've been around. We're not some fly-by-night show. If you want to be on, great. We'd love to have you. If you're too busy, have a nice day. We'll talk to you later. And give us a call when you want to come on our show.
I think that's a good attitude to have. Well, Ryan, I'm looking at you because when I think about booking, one of the things is the logistics of getting people involved. And a lot of people we're reaching out to are very busy individuals. I don't know a lot of people in the animal field who have like very lax open anytime between Tuesday and Friday should be great. No, I mean, people tend to be very busy, and you tend to be in a location where a lot of our field is not geographically. And I think your online presence is kind of the bulk of everything you're doing in the field these days, right? So what questions do you have or advice for the rest of this group here, given that you have a very online role in this field?
Yeah, as over the last couple of years, I've really began thinking more about the problems that we solve. And that is our purpose, to help people overcome their challenges. Well, that is the purpose of Animal Training Academy. I've been thinking more and more about that. And so we have problems like, how do we do this husbandry behavior? How do we work in this team setting in the zoo? How do we train this behavior for our show? But what I've come to realize is that the problems we actually solve are how that makes people feel. So it makes you feel frustrated. It makes you feel stressed. It makes you feel overwhelmed. It makes you feel burnt out, or we get compassion fatigue, all of these challenges. And as I talk about these things, I really see how it resonates with people, because we're all humans operating in this field. And so it's something that we focus on and try to focus on a lot in our show, is being conscious of mental health, and just curious about how you guys incorporate those conversations into your work.
To start. Well, Ari, I think we thought we were going to be starting an animal training podcast, but I don't know that that's what our show has actually become, right?
Well, yeah, that's definitely true. I think that, I don't know exactly. I mean, we're probably like the least planning of any podcast ever, maybe, but I kind of don't. I like that because it helps us to shape it. Like you were saying, Gray, let your conversations kind of go where they go and see where it takes you, which I think is awesome. And Chris and I both have worked really hard to use what we know and learn what we can about creating high functioning teams at our workplace, and work really hard at mastering communication skills and how to teach those communication skills, whether it's between us and an animal or us and another human. And I think that is almost always where our conversation ends up, is around the human element of what we do. And I think that focusing on that is so important, because we know when people are communicating at a high level within a team, that they create better welfare for the animals they're caring for anyways. It opens the door for everyone on the team to have important training conversations that aren't always easy, and knowing how to disagree well at a high level so that we can create solutions without damaging relationships in the process. It just almost always ends up that that's what we're talking about. And it's interesting to me. I from knowing Chris for so long, I know it's interesting to Chris, and the two of us enjoy thinking about that and talking about it and trying our best, like you said, Brian, to like help people overcome challenges. And it took me a long time as a growing leader and the current leadership role that I'm in to grow into a place where I learned that it's not my job to fix the things for people that are challenges for them, but to help them find tools and have resources to then take action and find their own solutions to problems. And that was definitely something that took me a long time, to not carry everyone's problems around myself and feel like I needed to do something to help those people myself in such a, my role is more passive than I thought it was when I started doing this thing originally. You're really just trying to set people up to learn the things that we are still learning, but have been learning for a while, on how to communicate really well. And I love that you feel like you've thought about this, Ryan, and now it's like you're realizing that it's not necessarily the challenges, but the feelings are the problems that you're helping people overcome, and how do we deal with stuff on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's really something since the pandemic, we've seen so many people in the labor force in general, but specifically in our field, focused on heavily. Like they are now talking about it. And it sounds like a lot of complaining to a lot of people, right? We hear a lot of us versus them mentality, and and we don't understand the younger generation and all of these comments back and forth, or management doesn't care about us and blah, 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 vice versa. But I think that the labor force in general started talking about this stuff during the pandemic, and that in itself, whether it sounds like it's complaining or not, it's good that people are talking about it, because if we're not talking about it, everybody's just dealing with it silently and we're not really solving any problems. So I love talking about it. I think it's a great topic. I think that even when we do focus on a training topic, we end up like veering towards like the human element and sometimes have to like rein ourselves back, because we have done quite a few episodes now where we've really focused on a specific thing as far as like a training concept or the science behind what we're doing, and really focusing on that. But I think Chris and I draw a lot of parallels no matter what route we go down, and between the human to human learning that happens and the human to animal learning that happens as well.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Jake.
No, I was saying that I love that about your podcast, that you have that as a forefront, because currently Animal Behavior Conversations is virtually textbook. Like in a textbook, this is a thing, let's go give examples, talk about it. But you were just talking about how a lot of it is human animal and also human human. Because if you think about a training session, if you are watching or someone's watching you, that training session happens, but then there's so much more around it with the feedback, that how it's given, how it's received. And by empowering people, giving people tools and resources to make that a better conversation is not only going to improve the lives of people, make things more positive, but also in turn improve the lives of the animals, because we're going to all be able to work as a unit as opposed to an individual person working that. So I love all those things, and I get so much from all the podcasts that talk about that, because it is such a critical, important role for us to all be able to effectively work together with the goal of giving our animals the best, most purposeful lives that we can.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the thing I reflected on as Ari was explaining that was just that, we're in a position where, what we do on a daily basis, many of us, directly impacts the lives of other organisms who can't always tell us what they need or what they want or what they should have. We are essential in that way, which, was put into relief during a time when there were essential and unessential people in a workforce, which, big debate about that probably on its own. But I think that the nature of our work often can isolate people, where you may be in a barn, by yourself for a long period of time, or you may be in an area of a zoo by yourself for a long time. And I think the greatest compliment that Ari and I got early on with this was, listening to this show kind of feels like I'm just listening to some of my friends talking. And I think that gave us the comfort to feel like we didn't have to always be on a really strict topic. We didn't really always have to be on we didn't say enough science words in this episode. We should probably do more science next episode. I mean, we have had those conversations as well, but I think that, I've been to enough zoos now as a consultant and other places where, I've been dealing with people either visibly frustrated, sometimes crying, saying, I don't understand why our zoos have this problem. And I don't think it's a zoo problem. I think it's a human problem. And I think that when we do get to dig into resources like Crucial Conversations and things that don't have to do with what we do, and to see how that resonates, that's one of the reasons why I've had the boldness to say, hey, Ari, I want to get these managers from a video game company to be on our animal podcast. Are you okay with that? And hey, guess what? Turns out they're talking about building strong teams. They're talking about, letting people not set themselves up to be martyrs or to cause problems. Like, it's like, okay, well, this is just human stuff. It's just, I like to think one of the avenues we haven't explored would be to get healthcare workers involved in this show, because I think they may have as close a parallel to what we do compared to some other industries where, we make decisions where if we do things poorly, lives suffer for it, which to some extent a lot of different jobs have. But I think we are a little unique in that way. So focusing on the challenges and opportunities, like Ryan said, that make that a reality, that's a backbone of what we do. Yeah, it just feels natural. Like, I don't think it feels like something to have to entertain. And that's one of the things I've always appreciated about Gray's show, because you've had these people who are directors and presidents and CEOs, and the conversation you end up having with some of those folks is it's very down to earth. It's just like, yeah, I struggle with this, or, I've always felt like I couldn't do this, so I focused on this thing, and that kind of made a path for me. And so it's nice to see everybody on this group in their own way to be able to kind of get into that angle of what we do with people. cool. And not necessarily, I think, focusing on it specifically. It's cool.
And I think you all are onto something, because, I dare I say I might have started in this field a little bit before some of you. It has not always been so open-minded. You talk about, the hourly staff work, talking more about the work experience, their mental and physical health. But I also think employers and managers are much more in tune to it, whether it was COVID or it was just naturally happening anyway. There is more of a sensitivity, I think, to how people are doing. Because when I started, you were expected to be grateful for having this amazing job working with animals. And that was supposed to cover a lot of the deficits in the workforce and in the workplace in terms of pay or time off or mental health or concern about how people are progressing and developing. A lot of that was kind of pushed aside as a priority because, hey, you get to work with killer whales. Suck it up, Buttercup. And it's nice to hear from all of you in your shows that you are addressing it not only from the concerns of keepers and trainers and aquarists and aviculturists, but also those managers and curators and directors, people who can actually affect some of that change on an institutional level. And I do think that's where we're headed as an industry, and that's good to see. I also like the fact that you bring in other elements like mental health. One thing that we've tried to push for every year, a couple of times a year at least, talking about the role of zoos in race relations, the diversity in our workforce or the lack thereof historically, some of the poor choices that zoos made historically in relation to race and putting human beings on display, for example, really terrible things like that. So I think it's important to highlight some of the soft underbelly of our field, because we aren't perfect and we don't have a perfect history. We are learning and growing, hopefully. And it's important to talk about these related topics, because as much as you all are trainers and love the science of animal training and what you do, there are other elements to all of that, as you've all pointed out.
Well, I want to ask you, Greg, because that's like something that I really admire about your interview style on the podcast, is that you don't shy away from these harder topics. And like, you just did a whole episode on the sexual harassment lawsuit that went through AZA. And I was like, I saw the title of your episode and I was like, dang, gotta listen to this one, because I really want to know how he's going to handle this. Like, more so than like, I don't need the dirt. I know enough about the situation. I was really curious about how you were going to guide that conversation in a way, because it would be really easy to say how you feel or your opinions and basically piss off a whole plethora of people, and then they're not going to hear you anymore. And when we're talking politics or tough conversations like that, it's very easy to ask questions or have a conversation in a way that somebody would just shut it off because they don't agree with you and you've kind of put them on the defensive and they don't want to hear what you have to say. But I think you do such a great job at guiding the conversation in a neutral way, just to find out more about whatever topic it is. So how first of all, how do you set up for an episode like that? And second of all, do you think that you feel like you have the platform to do that because of you have a lot of experience in this field? You've been in those situations before. You have the ability, you don't have a boss who's going to fire you over saying something about, like, is that part of it? Is there, like, tell me more about that.
Well, first of all, thank you for all those compliments in there. I will send you that gift card after the show. It's very kind of you to say, and I have to preface my response to all those young people, those new people that you've hired in because you talked to them on your show. You don't necessarily want to follow the Gray Stafford career model, because you're right. I do raise questions and I do ask questions because I think that accountability is in short supply in our world these days. And I think that zoos and aquariums, modern zoos and aquariums, whether they're AZA, ZAA, Alliance, whatever, or not accredited at all, I'm hard pressed to find another industry where people actively are trying to improve every single day. Maybe medicine falls into that camp. And so to me, there's a nobility about the work that you all do. And I still believe that 30 plus years later. Having said that, there's a lot of bullshit that's going on these days. And I feel old enough, and it happens once you turn 50, it'll all happen to you, where you just give less concern to what people think about what you have to say. That doesn't mean run your mouth and say unsubstantiated things, but it also means that if the emperor is not wearing any clothes, you point out the emperor needs to put on some underwear. And again, I don't recommend that for a first-year trainer or anyone who has a mortgage to pay and doesn't have an incredible spouse like I do, who's put up with my nonsense and allowed me the freedom, the flexibility to ask those tough questions when they need to be asked. Because I do think that the zoo and aquarium space has a more important role than ever. You know, we mentioned a guy named Ken Ramirez. Ken is taking the principles of operant conditioning that you all use every day, and he's applying it to wild species for conservation purposes. To me, that's the future of zoos and aquariums and all the training topics that you guys cover every week. That's the future. Because humans aren't going away and we aren't building more landmass for animals to hide from us. So we better find a way to help manage these situations better. So thank you for the compliment. Are there costs to it? You bet there are. There are costs to speaking truth to power at whatever level there is. And there have been times when I have scratched my head saying, why did I do that? Why do I say that? And I'm not suggesting that I have all the answers or I've seen it all or done it all. None of that is true. But I do think I think everyone in this field needs to know where they draw the line. Where I draw the line is different from where you draw the line, Ari, different from you, Shane, and everyone else here. I don't expect anyone to follow my line in the sand. But once you know what that line is for you, don't cross it. And before you're ever tempted to cross it or you're asked to cross that line, you sure as hell better know where that line is for you as a professional. And that's the best advice I can give people. And once you know where that line is, it's very easy to make those choices, just like bridging on a whistle. It's either criteria or it's below criteria. It's either within your line or it's exceeded your line, and you know what to do from there.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think that some people probably don't know that answer quite yet. So
And that's fine.
they're just figuring out where they stand, what they're comfortable with. And I think, like you said, you have a good support system. And I think like that comes from who you surround yourself with and if their line is the same as yours, right?
Right. No, that's a great point. Choose the right mentors in life. Surround yourself by good people, and good things usually flow from that.
Well, thanks for doing those hard episodes, Greg, because I think that your line is needed. You know, people need to hear those conversations, and not everybody is in a place where they could do what you're doing. And I'm thankful that you can have those conversations with people and put them in a place where people can learn from them and hear what you have to say and how people answer the questions you're asking.
Well, I had to laugh at your email in preparation for today where you said, how do you do these conversations without pissing people off? I wouldn't assume I haven't pissed people off. But I do appreciate the kindness. And I would just say that everyone's got to find their own pathway. And at the end of the day, I think zoo and aquarium professionals should hold their head high despite a lot of the noise out there, because the work that they do is really important and it's noble. There's a nobility to it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that you said nobility. It reminds me of Mark Simmons being on the ABMA podcast with you, Shane. That was a great episode. And like that whole story at the end in the cab, and what a great story. I think that was awesome. And it was really cool to hear it and to hear like how like the category that he puts our field in, just like you're doing right now, Gray, I think is awesome to lift everybody up, because I think a lot of people take a lot of things personally right now when we hear stuff about whatever it is, the killer whale flavor of the week thing that everyone's mad about or whatever it might be. I think like whatever bubbles up and then our field decides to take a stand one way or another, it weighs a lot on people who aren't even involved with these situations, just how the public reacts to it. And to give that much credit to the professionals in our field, I think is really, really amazing, because people like you, Gray, or Mark Simmons, or whoever it is, giving people the confidence to keep going if they feel like they've been beat down by some of the, even just seeing it find on the internet, or a hard conversation they had with a guest in their facility, I think is so important, because we are doing really important work. And I think we see a lot of people leaving the field currently for lots of reasons and very understandable reasons. But I hope that we are able to hang on to people who are going to continue to make huge differences in our field too.
Going off that, I'll just hop in. I feel like growing up as a 90s kid, I was saturated with Jack Hanna, Steve Irwin, the Krapp Brothers on Zubumafu, all those things. Like, that's where my passion for animals came from. And I think during that period of time, in general, there was this thought that getting guests in, that's how we connect them to animals. In the zoological setting, that's how we connect them. And this is just my thought that maybe in today's world where we have so much access to everything through the internet, through tons of streaming services, people have that. And what I feel like in my personal experiences, I'm finding that highlighting this training, the behavior, the relationships that we can have with animals, exactly what Mark was talking about on episode 10 of the ABMA's podcast, that is what I found, and I think is a way forward that our field is going, is bringing people into our story of how we build these relationships, how we can enact all these incredible, purposeful behaviors with our animals, and letting people see that and being able to experience not just the animal, but the animal's life is so important moving forward. And I love that all of these podcasts and tons of things are able to bring more people into that as well.
And I appreciate, Shane, that you guys, listening to the format of the show that you've kind of landed on, I really like that you include a little blurb that says, like, we're going to have lots of different people who have lots of different experiences and lots of different opinions. And that's theirs. Might not be ours as the ABMA, but we hope that you'll appreciate the fact that we've all had different experiences, and you'll listen to what people have to say, and you'll and hopefully you'll learn something out of it. And I know there's a little bit of like legalese, cover yourself sort of to that. I understand that. And I think that's smart. But it's also, I think if all we ever do, and most of modern life probably reinforces this now, if all we ever do is surround ourselves with people who think and feel exactly the same way that we do, we're going to be heavily reinforced for that. But it's not necessarily going to help us grow. So I appreciate that you've gone out of your way, and to the fact that I was so happy to see that, when that information was coming out about Keiko, and, seeing all this information about the whales, and, Ari and I for a minute going like, we're going to talk about this. And then looking at my phone, I'm like, no, Shane and Gray have it covered. I don't feel like I got to talk about this. They got it. I know they probably had other things planned, and their plans changed, and I appreciate that they did. That was so cool. Ari, I think I cut you off. Did you have something to say?
Oh, no, I remember having that conversation with you too, Chris, about, are we going to talk about this? And like, we have our thoughts, but I don't think there was anything more to add to the conversation than what you two were able to cover on your shows. And I think that we don't have the expertise specifically in that area like you do, Gray. And I don't, I think that you covered it really well. And it's great to be like, we can focus on other things because this is getting the attention it needs. And we don't want to put so much out there that then it's overload either. But Shane, saying like what you're talking about, kind of focusing on your podcast and how you've been doing this now for 19 episodes, and you started it, did you had like an idea of how maybe this was going to go, or what it was going to feel like, or the direction, or how your interviews were going to go? Do you feel like the ABMA podcast is turning out as you expected? Are you liking doing it? Is it more challenging in ways you didn't expect? How's it going?
I think that the biggest thing is, we talked about this before we started hitting record. Initially, I said this is going to be a 20 to 30 minute podcast. Every episode, 20 to 30 minutes. It'll be less time consuming, but as I think we can all attest, sometimes you just get rolling and you can't stop, and you don't want to cut anything out because it's the whole story that this guest or someone is talking about. So that's been one thing, is that I've just kind of learned to roll with it. I know myself have grown a lot in being able to help be more of that guide to people. I've found my groove more of letting the guest run the episode and just being there as someone that can add little things in, and constantly I have my computer open and they say something, I type something down so that way I can have them circle back to it and all that stuff. So I think that for me has been really cool. And I am very thankful to everyone in the community that has given me. Chris gave me so much information. I remember the day that we launched the podcast, I had no idea. In case anyone's trying to do this, launch everything 2 or 3 days before you announce it, because certain podcast sites take a long time to accept you as a podcast. So we had Google Podcast took almost a week. And so that was something I remember the day of. I'm texting Chris. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out. What's happening? What are all these words mean that I thought I was prepared for, but I'm not? So it's been really great to have tons of people that are there to support and give advice and help through this and grow this podcast.
How's it been like representing the ABMA? I mean, I feel like that's a different thing. Like Ryan's representing himself and his business essentially and his membership, which is really cool. Gray is representing himself. Chris and I represent NEI and ourselves, but you are representing this organization of hundreds of people and a board of directors doing a podcast. How's that been for you?
It's funny because a lot of the guests are telling me how nervous they are. They've never done a podcast before. And I told them I'm nervous every single podcast a little bit, but it's like good nervous, like you're playing a sport. I think that the really cool thing is what Chris mentioned is we add that into the beginning of our podcast episodes because as an organization, we want to be inclusive of everything. No topic should be off limits as long as we're talking about it in a professional, constructional manner. So with that thought of that everyone's going to have a little bit of different take on it, I think is great. And I'm sure there are tons of topics. I mean, Chris did antecedents with us, and there are probably 10 other parts of antecedents that as we go down the road, we're going to come in and Chris might come back. Someone else might come in and give those different perspectives, which I think is really great. And as representing the ABMA, that's the goal, is that this is for everyone, no matter where you are, especially for all of our members that are international as well. So I think that people have just been really happy and excited about it, which has helped me and given me confidence as well. And it's also created a lot of really cool conversations where people have already reached out to me asking about something specific or saying, I've never thought of it this way. That's kind of changing the way I'm viewing it, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, that's great. That's really cool. And it is really reinforcing, right? I say it on the podcast all the time, but like every time we get an email is like the best day ever. I'm like, people are listening and they want to know stuff and talk to us. And it couldn't be more reinforcing.
So along those lines, Ari, how do you all measure success? I mean, I'm sure we'd all like to be Joe Rogan and have his kind of income from a podcast. But other than that, how do you all measure success?
Well, I think for Chris and I, part of our measure of success is, did we get our episode done for the week? So that's part of it. And like every time we put that episode out on Thursday, I'm like, yes. Like that, I mean, in itself is a positive. I think for me personally, measuring success in the podcast feels like, did we talk about something important to us? Because if it was important to us, it's likely going to resonate with more people because we are in the field. We do this job. And if it's something that we care to talk about and it's interesting, then I feel like there has to be somebody out there who also feels like it's interesting. And super honestly, like we have done podcasts where I'm like, oh, I don't know what we're going to talk about. And I'm tired. And like, even once we do the podcast and we wrap it up, we're like, that was a good episode, but like we've done better episodes, like it's not our favorite episode of all time. And then sometimes we have conversations with each other or a guest that are just like, wow, that was killer. Like that conversation was so good. And I learned so much. We had a couple of the representatives from Gray's Growing Resilience Among Zoo Employees. Yes. I'm getting better at acronyms, y'all. We had two of the representatives of Gray's on the podcast a few weeks ago. And like, I learned so much about myself on that podcast and it was really interesting. And I felt like it was such a good way to show some vulnerability that I hope other people are also able to even take further within themselves and explore learning in front of people, because I learned things like that I thought I was doing really well that I probably am not doing as well as I could to cope with certain things. And so those episodes for me, when I'm like, wow, I just learned a lot, I feel like that's a really great measure of success as well. I love when I bug Chris all the time to look up our analytics, which I think neither of us are really good at doing on a regular basis. But sometimes I'm like, hey, who's listening to us? Because sometimes we have like the random listener in Ethiopia or something, which could be a bot, but it's fun to look at that stuff and to see which episodes are the most listened to, how many people have subscribed to the podcast. Things like that are interesting, but I don't hold them as such a high regard as if I feel like Chris and I just had a good conversation and we put out a good episode. And hopefully it reaches somebody who needed to hear whatever we were talking about. But I don't know. What do you think, Chris? Do you have other measures of success?
No, I mean, it's for me. Yeah, I think if we wanted to be more professional about this, we might go through some, different angles, and moving ahead as we think about like the bigger picture of our company, maybe we'll tweak some things here and there. But I agree. I think it's a thing we're really doing for ourselves. And if other people get something out of it, that's awesome. I'm really curious to hear Ryan's answer to this, because I think more than anybody else I've ever heard in this space, in our field or out, the amount of time that you devote to appreciation, gratitude, and community building, particularly, I think is fascinating. So Ryan, for you, I'll be straight up, like, I am jealous of the community of folks you've been able to put together. But I mean, that's just a testament to the time, effort, and skill and energy you put into it. Like, at this point now that you've put all these years and all this, you come at this kind of online community from so many different angles. For you, like, what is the measure of success now?
We're having it because Ari said sitting here learning, and I've been sitting here silently just absorbing all of this. And might look like I'm looking off to the side doing some other tasks, but I'm just like furiously making notes. And it's because I'm cued to, because I'm in a podcast, and as a host, that's what I do. So even though this isn't something that I've set up as a host of ATA, I've just noticed my antecedents have just cued this behavior of like furiously taking notes. So I've been writing so many things down that I don't even want to answer your question, Chris. I just want to bounce off everyone, but I'm going to answer your question. What was the question again?
What's your measure for success?
What's my measure for success? Yeah. So I mean, the ultimate measure for success, I think, is that we are improving the lives of animals and humans. Like that is why we do all of the things. All right. And the really cool and also bizarre thing is we never know how many we've reached. Right. So I'm going to do some math right now on my phone, but like, let's think about this. If we have like, say, 15,000 downloads a month for a podcast show, and that's an individual listening to the show, 15,000 of them, how many people do you think that one listener influences? Like let's say each person influences 10 people, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to times that by 10, right? And then how many of those 10 people, let's say those 10 people influence another 2 people, so I'm going to times that by 2. And then let's say that those 2 people influence another person, so I'm going to times that by 1. So let's say, times by 2. So let's say every month, like if we get 15,000 downloads, like at a small estimate, we're probably touching the lives of about 600,000 humans. And then if you think about the animals that are influenced by that, I mean, that is my measure of success. So I care about download numbers because I care about the listener. And I know that the listener has training challenges, and I know they feel this way. But I really like what Ari said before, that it was about helping our listeners find tools and find resources to take action. And then get unstuck. That is really what ATA is about. And I think the podcasts that we all make are about is helping people get unstuck. And what does that do for them? It makes them feel confident. It builds their skills. It builds their knowledge. And ultimately, it helps them improve the lives of animals and humans. So if I know that I'm doing that through data on a screen, I don't. And that's why I said it's bizarre and also kind of cool, because we just have no idea like where the ripples from sitting down here and talking with each other today are going to reach Ethiopia or Philippines or Wellington, New Zealand. I've got people that listen that live 5 minutes down the road from me. We could go have a conversation, but they're listening on the podcast. So I think that is my measure of success. It's immeasurable.
It is. Oh, and I have to add one more thing because I thought of it with what Ryan just said. I think the two things that have happened, and they were pretty early on, and I will still never forget them. It's the first time when I think it was either at a conference or a training workshop that I saw people more sheepish than normal to come talk to Ari and I because they knew us from the show. And I got to see people use the word fangirling and fanboying. That was kind of funny. But my absolute favorite one was one of my coworkers, Katie, when she pulled up at the end of the day, we were all walking to our cars to head out. And she just pulls up right next to my car, window down, and just stares at me. Doesn't say a word. She just stares at me. And I'm just looking at her and I'm kind of looking back. And I realize I'm hearing my voice come out of the speakers of her car. And she just sat there and didn't say anything. And then just smiled. And I was like, that's weird. And she goes, and drove away. So I think that was a weird little measure of success. And I know Ari gets a tremendous jolt of adrenaline and serotonin when she knows that our coworkers are listening to us because we pay them to do that. But we do it on their free time too.
Yeah, that to me is like the biggest compliment, that these people who have to hear us talk like literally every day in many aspects, like a meeting or a one-on-one or just during the day, whatever we're doing. I'm on mic, Chris is on mic. They listen to us all the time. And then they get in their car and listen to us. Like, could it be any cooler? I don't think so. Like, that's awesome. And Ryan, what you're talking about with like the ripple effect, I know you talk a lot within your membership, and I think is really cool and such a great concept to apply to what we do with animal training. And we did an episode with Ron McGill last year. How long ago did we do that? It's probably been
Sounds right.
Maybe 6 months, a year, somewhere in there. And we did an episode, talked to Ron McGill from Zoo Miami. A couple months later, we get this email from this older woman who lives in Iowa, I think. And she really likes Ron McGill because he's on the radio and she listens to him. And she was looking for something on a podcast platform and came across our podcast, and she listened to it. And we've basically become pen pals now, me and this older lady who we chat all the time. Lori I think she's from Iowa. Lori is so sweet. And she really was just super impacted by this conversation we had with Ron and things that she was going through, it really difficult things in her life, and how that helped her. And it has nothing to do with her job. Like, she doesn't do our job. And it was just a really cool thing to see, like that ripple of like how far this can go. Like you're saying, Ryan, that it's not just the listener we're reaching, but like there's another layer to that, and then another layer to that, and the different types of people we get to reach out to on this forum is just, I never really thought anybody who wasn't in our field would ever listen to this thing, other than maybe like a family member, like I didn't expect to have anybody else listening and learning things about behavior on that level. And I think that's just so cool, and something that you do so well with your membership, Ryan. Like Chris said, I think the support and the way that you talk to your membership to make them feel safe to ask questions about things that they're going through, whether it's with their pets or clients, or if they work in the field and they're training animals, just to feel safe to ask questions, feeling like I should know how to fix this thing with my dog. And I feel like I should have this answer, but I don't. And I am okay with asking this group of people and being really vulnerable to say, what do I do? Everything I know is not working here, and I'm really stuck. How can I get unstuck? And everyone just rising to the occasion. Like your membership, it's really unbelievable how they respond to these questions. It is just a plethora of people saying supportive things, and thanks for being vulnerable. Thanks for sharing this. Oh, that's really tough. I'm sorry you're going through this. That's a really hard one. Let me offer some advice or thoughts, or have you tried this? And there's never egos or judgment or you should have known that, or it's just the coolest community. And you've done that through your awesome antecedent arrangement. You have a great set of experts expectations for this group of people. And I think that is just really cool. So when you started ATA, were you expecting that like what it is grown into now? Is that where you were aiming to go? What was your initial, like did you start the podcast at the same time you started your membership group? Was that all at the same time and they kind of coincided? Has it grown one out of the other?
Yeah, I think firstly, thank you for saying all of those really nice things, and Chris as well for saying all of those really nice things. And shout out to the ATA community, because rewind 2 years, I was in there 2-3 hours every day. And now I've got a team who we've trained up and are doing a lot of that work for me because I just couldn't. And I didn't start anything with ATA with any particular structure that it was going to get into. My environment shaped me. Our members shaped me, and they shaped what ATA is. So I would say that ATA and the community aspect of ATA has not been built by me. It's been built by my environment, and my environment is our members, and they've taught me what they need, and I've managed to dedicate times and resources to make that happen.
How has that changed for you since COVID? I would imagine, like Chris and I were helping to do our TEC Talks, which were our online like at first they were like every day for a week. We were just putting out online content for people to be able to learn about different things from animal training to team behavior and things like that. And we saw a huge following early on in the pandemic. And then now that everybody's back to work, it's been smaller and smaller audiences. We've adjusted how we share those, how often we put them out. Have you seen a difference? Like you were pre-pandemic, then the pandemic happened, and now we're like, I guess as post-pandemic as we can be right now. Have you seen a difference in your membership flow as the pandemic has changed?
I think so. I remember being in antenatal class with my wife and seeing this COVID poster on the wall and thinking, come on, this is New Zealand. Really? I don't need to wash my hands religiously every single time I do anything. That's not going to happen here. And then we went into hospital, and Sapphire, wifey's labor was about a week long. So we went into hospital, having that mindset. We came out and we're like immediately into lockdown, and we're like, what just happened? Wow. We have this baby and now we're in lockdown. And I remember going, how do we help our members? I remember talking to, and shout out to my wife, and as Grace said, to the awesome spouses that put up with us. But I remember saying to Sapphire, I was like, how do we help people? Like, what do we do here? And so I put up a post and I said, hey, if you want to chat about what's going on or just anything, book a free 20-minute chat with me and I'll connect with all of you guys. I added it up. I ended up talking to ATA members for about 7 days straight. Like if you add up the time back to back, and it is the best thing I've ever done for Animal Training Academy because I learned so much about what people need. And I think that, that was an opportunity. COVID provided an opportunity for me to get better at what we do. And, it influenced us, I think, because it influenced everything. But our members stuck with us.
That's awesome.
And, we already had that platform. Everyone's like, oh my God, how do I go online? I was like, does anything actually change for us? I don't think anything changed, really.
Yeah.
But I think some of the things that you guys have been talking about, and thinking about this and where I'm landed now is that, and with the community, how it has changed for me is that I'm really realizing that our role and the people that I pay to help me run that community, our role is being models. And I think as podcast hosts as well, our role is to model for people. As you're talking about Gray doing in this conversation, is how to model having those conversations, and being a parent, I put a microscope on myself now. Like, am I teaching her the correct, air quotes, correct behaviors based on what I'm doing? And I think a lot of what we've built in our community has been through modeling. This is how we treat each other, which you guys already know because you do it with your dogs and your horses and your zoo animals. So you just got to do it with each other. But what words do we use? Vulnerability, bravery, courage. That is so important. And we do say that a lot because every time someone posts, they open themselves up for criticism. And so we just acknowledge that. And I think it's just become part of the culture. And like I said, like I'm a lot more hands off than I used to be, but it's got a life of its own now.
That's awesome. And balancing all of your ATA responsibilities with being a dad, how has that transition been?
It has been another opportunity. So I burnt out really badly because my mother-in-law was here from England when the pandemic started, and then she got stuck here. So she was here for 6 months, staying in our house, and then she left. And then me and Sapphire were like, we had to be parents for the first time ever. And our daughter was like nearly 6 months old. And it was too much, and I burnt out. What that looked like for me is I cried uncontrollably for like 3 days. It was scary as heck, but it was an opportunity. And now I'm like, if burnout starts to come around again, because we're expecting our second now, I'm like, hello, old friend. I know you. And because I can see the little towels. I missed the meeting here. I said something that's out of character for me. Like I know these towels. I'm feeling really tired and drained. So I can leverage that now. And I think being vulnerable about that, sharing that on a podcast platform helps others and helps me as well deal with the pressures of 2 jobs, being a father and running an international company.
Yeah, that's a lot. And so you said you can tell, you have some tells for when you're kind of headed towards the burnout lane. What are the things that you plan to do to cope that you learned from that last experience, which I'm sorry you went through, Ryan? That's tough. And I think if not all of us, most of us know what that feels like when you've kind of hit a wall and don't really know what to do next. But I love that you think of it as an opportunity. That's a very Steve Martin thought process. He always has said problems are opportunities. And I think that's your opportunity to think about, okay, now I can recognize this thing, but recognizing it is only part of it, right? And I think a lot of people are dealing with knowing that they're burnt out or knowing they're going towards that place. What are your personal ways to help cope with that stuff?
There are many. The first thing I had to learn to do was to say no to everything, which comes with guilt, which comes with FOMO, but it was about prioritizing myself and my family. So saying no was a journey, and it's a hard thing to do. Someone's like, hey, do you want to come do this really cool training project in this other country? And you're like, no, like that burns. It's like, oh my God, that would have been so much fun. But the consequence of that would have been too high. So that's one thing. Self-care time. So finding an activity that's nothing to do with animal training or business that you lose track of time doing. So for me, we got a decent sized property. It's just gardening. I can get out there and get in front of a lawnmower. I had the water blaster on last weekend. It's so reinforcing, water blasting. We all know that, right? So I just lost track of time, and like every time I go up to my deck now, but like that got my hands dirty. I wasn't thinking about work. Wifey facilitated the day so that I could do that. And it was just me just doing something mindless, having days off, proper days off, and making sure that's precious. Like that is precious, those days off. And knowing the difference, one last thing, knowing the difference between important and urgent, and prioritizing important, non-urgent things like family, friends, self-care, health, and because a lot of things you get emails come through and they seem really urgent, and your business stuff seems really urgent, but what's really important is being a good dad and being a good husband and being a good son. So prioritizing those things and making that distinction. Interested to hear, been talking for a while now, interested to hear other people's thoughts on those things as well.
For me, I recently just moved across the country, and I had to deal with the email buildup that definitely happened. And I know you guys talked about how you had episodes every single week. Last week, I recorded an episode with Kelly Myers. So if you're listening to this, Kelly, we'll get your episode back. And we recorded a long time ago. And since I record through the ABMA's Zoom, because I don't have my own Zoom, unfortunately, that whole recording got deleted. So it was this devastating thing that I also waited the day before to edit everything because I was behind. And so that was really rough because I felt terrible because Kelly and I were excited to have her episode come out. Luckily, she's awesome and we're going to do it down the road. But that was something where at 9:00 at night, I was trying to find something to have an episode. And I think that's part of being vulnerable. I just said, listen, I had technical difficulties. I just moved across the country, and being able to be okay with that is important in everything that we do, that we all can't be perfect. we have to be gentle with ourselves. And also, I always talk about in that moment, that was a success for the animal. Well, for us as well, we can think about in this moment with these situations, that was a success for me. Maybe I wouldn't have viewed that a while ago, but in this moment it was. And I think that's important in life.
I also think it's important to not get bogged down in the technical side of producing an audio show like this, because I know 6 years ago, I was brand new to it. I was finding, software patches to deal with using Skype to separate audio from my audio to my guest's audio, little things like that I have no background in whatsoever. And I just had to kind of discover my way. Nowadays, I am far more focused on the content. And I think that the audience, and tell me if you have a different point of view on this, but I think the audiences are a lot more forgiving about sound quality. The occasional pop, the occasional and ah. I mean, I do my best to try to eliminate those from my speech, but they still exist, myself, guests, and so forth. So we try to, improve those a little bit, but I don't spend nearly the kind of editing time I might have 5 years ago because life is short, other priorities, as you all mentioned. But also, I think the focus should be on the content, the person that you're interviewing, and getting to whatever story they need to tell, whatever information they have to share. To me, is where my priority is as a podcast host and producer. It doesn't mean I like it when the sound audio is crazy. We just did a live episode, Trekking Gorillas, where I cut in every once in a while saying, here's what's happening. The audio is not BBC quality. And I fessed up to that at the beginning of the episode to let people know it was going to be rough, but this was the best we could do. And I think people appreciate that candor and are a little more forgiving about sound quality than they might have been when podcasts first hit the scene. Much like video. I mean, I don't know if you remember the movie Blair Witch Project, but I think that was a watershed film because it basically introduced the audience to camera shots that were not steady. And now everyone's got their own video production in the form of their phone, and people tolerate that lack of video quality. I think the same kind of thing has happened to some extent with sound quality, but I'd be curious to know what you all think on that.
Yeah, well, I can tell you the Blair Witch Project I saw in the theater and terrified me, and I didn't sleep for like 3 days.
And it's not that good a film, to be honest.
But I didn't know. I saw it. I thought it was all real. I was freaked out. I'm glad it wasn't real. Go ahead, Chris.
No, I was going to say, so for me, I mean, because I started doing a different show unrelated to animal stuff in 2012, which was pretty new for podcasting at that time. I knew I didn't know a lot. I didn't know what I didn't know, but I knew there was a lot I didn't know, and you kind of muddle through it and figure it out. But I think a big turning point for me is because I do listen to a lot of shows, and I want for the ones who sound great. I've reached out to people and like, how do you do that? What are you using? What's your mic? What are your settings? And what I've come to realize is the ones who I really think are like a marked cut above everything else. These are people who either do this full time or in almost all instances pay other people a lot of money to make their show sound like that. And that was never what this was going to be. So so I have the benefit of having a co-host where, especially if we're not in a room together, I can go, Ari, you're really quiet, or you can say, Chris, you're really blown out. And, I can fix a lot of that stuff afterwards. The day I found out that I could record Zoom a specific way so that we had our own audio tracks, whoa, mind blown. I got to edit us independently, was huge. So I think that it's fun because I think that the medium kind of grew in a certain way that it did, but then the barrier for entry continuing to get lower with technology becoming more accessible, and then the exacerbating factor of the pandemic probably also introducing a lot of other people to this. I've joked with other people before. It's like, I firmly believe everybody should have a podcast because I think it's super fun. And the nature of the internet being such that, hey, think of any weird thing that you're interested in at all that you think is like the most niche, weird, stupid, obscure, dumb thing.
Like drywall?
There you go. Gyp rock, if you're on Ryan's side of the world. We found out because of this show. There are 16,000 other people in the world who are as obsessed with that thing as you are. So I think that if we lean on the direction of this and say, hey, it's what we're talking about that's important, not the way it sounds, then like Grace said, I think that there's a lot more forgiveness for that. I don't notice it anymore if I'm listening to other things and there's little things things in the background, especially because a lot of the shows that I was listening to before 2020, when they went remote, ran into a whole new set of production challenges that they never ran into. So for it, not at all unusual to, hang on, Ari, yeah, she's gone. Okay, well, we're going to keep going. Hopefully she rejoins us at some point. That would have been unforgivable early on. Okay, everybody stop. Let's find a clean edit point. Let's go back. Okay, and go. Yeah, I mean, we've done things like that before, but yeah, I think keeping it fun, keeping it light, keeping it conversational. That was always an important thing for us. Shane,
Chris,
you've been doing a great job.
Yeah, I was going to say, Chris, do you remember like the early episodes we did of the TEC Talk webinars? And our boss tends to be, he wants to do everything the best way we could possibly do anything, which is it's great because we're always working to improve. We always learn because of that attitude. But doing a webinar, there's a lot of technical challenges that can occur. And I remember, because I think Susan is always on most of our shoulders, right? So Dr. Susan Friedman was helping us with those early TEC Talk webinars, and Steve being like, how do we do this seamlessly? And how do we move this? And well, what if there's this glitch or what happens? And Susan was kind of like the calming voice of reason that she always is, and gave us the like permission to just be okay with all of that early on. Like, this is the internet. People know that. It's fine. And I think that we've really like taken that maybe to the next level, Chris and I on the podcast, where we're just like, whatever, we'll figure it out as we go. But that was really helpful in those early days of just knowing that Susan had more experience doing webinars and interviews and things like that over the interwebs, and giving us that permission of like somebody who is so professional and has such a high level of skill and information to share, and just being like, it's fine. And that was really nice to hear from her. And I think set us all in a place where we were like, it's okay. We're just going to go with it, which is really more our style, because that's what we do on stage. Our style is not follow a script, do the thing, hit the points, do your blocking right. Like, we're very improv, stand-up comedy with spurts, like we just kind of go with it. So that was a nice bit of feedback we got that gave us permission to do the same thing when we're doing things like the podcast or the webinars.
Well, you said it earlier, Ari, you used the term ego. And I think you have to take your ego out of the equation. And if you've all been on stage, there's very little ego left when you've been pooped and peed on and bitten in front of a live audience or a television audience, right? I mean, What else can happen? So yeah, letting some of that go and just rolling with it, laughing with it. I mean, I'd be curious to know how much humor plays a part in your shows, because I tell guests every time I approach them, I said, we want to be informative, we want to be casual, and as appropriate, we want to have humor. Humor is the best way to build those bridges, I think, to an audience. And so curious about your approach to not just when things go well, but when things go haywire, or when you have that one guest that is really, really like pulling teeth to get information from. How do you guys handle those kind of situations?
Have you experienced that yet, Shane, on the podcast?
I have not. I've had very amazing guests that have all been great in doing those things. So I have not had that. But I remember when I was first starting this, my Secret Santa gift from our work exchange from my boss, Pablo, he gave me a book that was like 101 Intro to Podcasting. And so I read it, and it makes sense, because when we're doing shows and presenting to people, the number one thing is you have to be yourself. If you're fake, you're not going to connect. Just be yourself. And myself personally is very weird, and puns just fly into my head left and right. I don't know how my brain works sometimes. There's like 6 tabs open and 4 of them are jokes. So I have leaned into that, and I found that I have to just be myself. And if there's something like that, and then for me, it's helped a lot with guests that have never done a podcast before and they're feeling nervous. A lot of things in life, you make a little joke, you start laughing, you relax and stuff like that. So I think it's really important just to be ourselves. And that's what people want to listen to. Like you said, they want to listen to a conversation. They're not tuning into a podcast to pretend like they're back in college, listening to a lecture that they might fall asleep to. They're listening listening to a podcast to engage with it. And they're kind of like the other participant in this conversation as well.
Yeah, I think that the way I look at it is, we want everything to be a conversation. And I feel that way when I'm doing this or when I'm on stage with an audience, even though people don't tend to talk a lot who are on the other side of the stage, but you can set it up so that they can through their body language or through their, the way that they react to the things you do. And I think that the thing that I just try to remember and is that I take it on myself as it's my responsibility to keep the conversation going, whether I'm on stage with an audience or whether I'm sitting in front of a microphone like this. I don't have to do it by myself because I'm often with Ari, but we know that, when something's not happening, it's our job to make something happen. I don't put that on somebody else. There have been times that it's a little harder than others. People are a little quieter than others. That's fine. You just sort of work with it. But yeah, I think that it's just, I think it's a bit of advice I think I got early on was that like, look, if you're genuine and you're being honest in the way that you're talking with people and where you're coming from and what your feelings are in that moment, like there is no wrong. There's no wrong. You can't screw it up unless there is a PR person sitting there who said, hey, you can't talk about this thing. And then I accidentally talked about this thing. I haven't done that, but I hope I will one day because I'll learn from that. But
from where you work, can you not talk about Bruno or is that legal?
That's a reference to something I'm sure involves something. Listeners, if you want to Google it, you can.
Okay.
That knocking you're going to hear at your door soon, Shane, is some lawyers. It's fine. But humor, everybody. I think humor is what comes out of when you can tell somebody is having fun and you're willing to just let it be fun and try to not let it be something other than that. I mean, we laugh a lot on this show, and I think that that's just because for me, the thing that's funniest about this is because, we do the animal thing professionally. I still think it's funny that somebody pays me for this. That's hilarious because it's so fun and so weird that what we get to do. So I think I like to think there's a certain level of absurdity to all of this. And to jump on the ego thing that Gray mentioned, like I think having a really good sense of humor about yourself is really important for the kind of thing we do. I think the people who I have the hardest time dealing with are ones who are extremely self-serious. And some of the roles that the people we have that we work with are in these shows have extremely serious roles. But I think once they realize that we just want to talk to them about like why they're doing what they're doing, how they got into it, what's the fascination for them, and all of a sudden that veneer can kind of go down. We've gotten that bit of feedback from a bunch of different people. Like, oh, this didn't turn out the way I thought it was going to be. Like, I'm used to giving interviews a certain way, talking about things a certain way. I didn't know what you were going to say, but I wasn't worried about what you were going to say. I wasn't worried about what you were going to ask me because you made me feel really comfortable. You let me know that like, hey, at any time, change the subject if you want me to, and it'll be fine. And because I think we're just coming from a place of curiosity, then it feels really comfortable because our goal is never, hey, I can't wait to get this person on here so we can finally nail them to the wall. Like I would have no interest doing that. I mean, even somebody who maybe I had very different beliefs with, it's really just interesting to get to know why people think the things that they do and why they do the things that they do. And that's one of the purposes of this. I think it's like if Ari and I could ever have the opportunity to just, she reaches out to me and says, hey, there's this person who wants to do this thing. I've never heard of them. I don't know what they do. Yeah. Okay, sure. I can't think of what I would say no to. That's just me.
Maybe Bruno.
Maybe
Bruno. Like I said, there's 4 tabs and they're all jokes. Go on, Ryan.
No, Bruno's a great one. My question's gone because I'm just singing their song in my head now. I've got a young daughter, so I've listened to that song many times. And when I first heard it, like, oh my God, I could not get that out of my head. Our whole family was singing it for weeks. I think one of the things, but it's a quote and I have no idea who it comes from. So I don't like not giving credit, but I don't know who to give credit to. But the saying is perfection is the enemy of good enough and good enough gets results. And that was definitely what started ATA, like, especially because I had never released content. I was just like, publish. And I know that people struggle with that, thinking about getting into this and getting analysis paralysis and overthinking things to the point that they become paralyzed and they don't take action. So that's been really key to ATA, is not being worried about perfection, but being conscious of growth and trying to always improve. One more thing quickly, I just realized another measure of success is getting our guests to passion talk, and I get credited for that, but Teresa McEwen from Tag Teach International said that on our show, and it's kind of stuck with us. It looks like me asking guest Peter Clark from Australia where people can go to find her online, and 45 minutes later her saying, what was the question again, Ryan? Like, so if I can get people passion talking like that in my show, then I feel like I've been successful. And then those people that get stuck, or the people that you feel a little bit stuck drawing information out of, I write everything down that our guest says to the best of my ability. And then I highlight bits that I want to come back to. And so having that helps bring people out a little bit, like drilling down. And they're like, you remember that I said this specific thing? And I think people feel listened to when they said that, and they start to open up, so they become more comfortable over time. And then using the things you write down as jokes as palate cleansers, though. Like, we've done like a real serious bit. We need like a little bit of light relief. So having the ability to add some humor at the right time to just take some of the pressure off, I think is something that I've been trying to grow and improve on, and helps people feel a little bit more comfortable.
Well, that's part of good storytelling, isn't it, Ryan? I mean, you bring people up, you take them down. You guys know this is show performers, right? But I am curious about something you said too, because I agree with it. And that is, it's very different being an interviewee versus an interviewer. I mean, for 20 years, I was the guy talking about all these different animals and telling those stories. But sitting on the other side of the microphone, listening skills have proven to be the most important, because you can go in with a plan and an idea of what you want to ask and what you think your guest is going to say. But it's only if you take the time to listen and jot notes down, as you say you do, Ryan, and come back to it. That, I think, is the sign of a really good podcast host, someone who can listen and circle back if necessary, or move on and move the conversation forward, because you're getting bogged down in the weeds on something that's not as compelling as what you know your guest wants to share. I think listening is I use listening when I was spokesperson for my zoo, because I always wanted to make sure the host interviewing me, I set them up for success and paid homage to them. It's their show. It's their time. I'm a guest. But that listening skill, I think, is vital to anyone who's considering a podcast. And I agree, more people should do it. All of your shows complement each other and help push the ball forward as far as animal training, animal welfare, animal well-being, conservation. All those things are important to your listeners. But listening, it starts with good listening skills. And that is something that I still struggle with. I have to train myself to listen more and to hear what people are trying to say, and then help them bring it out.
Like that. That is a very, very good piece of advice. And that seems like a pretty good place to wrap up now, to thank all of you who have listened to this. If our nefarious scheme goes off as we have planned, you may be hearing this show on one of 4 different podcast feeds, because I think we're all planning on releasing this as our episode this week. So for those of you who have not heard any of the different shows, we should make sure people know where to find us. So, Ari, where can people find our show?
So if you want to listen to our show on basically any of your places that you would get a podcast, you can look for the NEI TEC Talk podcast. If you type in Natural Encounters, it usually pops up right away. You can also email us at podcast@naturalencounters.com. But watch out, Chris might rope you into being a guest on the show. But I do love an email, and I will not let him force you to do anything that you don't want to do. But we would love to hear from you. And we always love getting feedback too. So anytime our listeners email us and offer any thoughts, suggestions, or random sound bites that we add into our shows sometimes, love it. It's awesome. So yeah, you can find us on basically any podcast platform or our website, naturalencounters.com. You can stream it right from there.
Very good. Shane Gorbett, where can people find your show?
Like I said, on whatever podcast platform, just type in Animal Behavior Conversations, or you can type in the ABMA. Both will come up. We also have it linked on the ABMA website. And then if you have questions or anything, abc@theabma.org. And one thing I just would like to say is that if you normally don't listen to one of our podcasts and you think that some kind of collaboration, or if you are more familiar with one of our podcasts and you want to give a suggestion or something to someone else's, reach out, because all of us have each other's information. We do this for all of you to have benefits. So continue reaching out, and we will continue doing what you all want.
Ryan, where can people find ATA stuff?
So ATA stands for Animal Training Academy, and our show is creatively called the Animal Training Academy Podcast Show. So you can search for that anywhere. So search for that, listen to it, and change the world, positively impact the lives of the animals and humans that you work with.
I love it. And Dr. Stafford?
Well, thank you. And like Ari said, you can find us Zoologic, 2 words. I have a physics background and I love Star Trek, so Zoologic just appealed to me. You can find it on all the major platforms, and certainly go to our website, ireinforce.com. We have a Facebook page for the podcast as well. We love to hear from people. We appreciate the feedback. We appreciate the constructive criticism, and we just appreciate the fact that people take the time to listen to our humble little podcast. So thank you.
Very cool. And I have a feeling all of us may do some creative editing for intros and outros for our individual shows. So we'll just sign off by saying thank you to everyone. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Thank you to the listeners. Guys, thanks so much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behavior geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.